Transformations take cleaned, combined data and turn them into something that is truly actionable. This is where the majority of the logic in your flow often ends up living, and the good news is that if you can describe your process in words, then you can replicate it in Parabola. That's the skill that we've been building throughout this course, taking your understanding of a process, putting it into words, understanding the core concepts, and then having Parabola build it through a sequence of repeatable steps. Now I want you to think about what you're currently doing in Excel. Things like dragging formulas, creating pivot tables, and formatting data so that it's ready for upload in another system. The goal of this lesson is to teach you how to take all of those one-off actions and turn them into repeatable steps in your workflow in Parabola, and to get started, we'll highlight the most common categories of data transformations. When it comes to data transformations, we usually see transformations fall into one of three broad buckets: calculations, business logic, and formatting. I'll run through some common examples across each bucket. Calculations refer to the math formulas and the aggregations that you're probably doing via formulas and pivot tables in Excel and Google Sheets today. That includes things like multiplying and dividing columns, summing up or counting values based on something like an ID, state, or date time period, creating roll-ups, and also forecasting values out going weeks or months into the future. Business logic often involves those calculations, but also includes things like nuanced if-else logic, which often creates different branches within a flow, as well as things like assigning statuses, categorizing data, and looking for exceptions and edge cases within your data that usually a human would have to find manually. Finally, we have formatting. Formatting shows up early in the flow building framework when we're cleaning our data, and then usually shows up again at the very end when we take our combined transformed data and get it ready to send off someplace else. That usually involves renaming or reordering columns, sorting our data, pivoting or totally reshaping tables of data, and doing things like formatting to match our desired output for a report or a different system where we're uploading this data. Now that we understand the three different broad categories of transformations, let's go ahead and apply this in our flow. Jumping back in, so far we've pulled our invoice and rate card data, we've cleaned it, and we've combined it. And to show you an example of what we're trying to actually find here, here is one specific invoice line item where on our invoice we were charged $13.59, but our contract says we only should have been charged $3.29. Now we need to build that transformation logic that actually helps us catch discrepancies like that one. While again, I could keep it pretty simple and just say, hey Parabola, go ahead and find those discrepancies, I'm going to use a prompt here that really shows off some best practices for prompting. I'm starting by saying use the invoice and contract rate to calculate an invoice discrepancy. Based on that value, populate a new column called discrepancy status, where we use one of the following values. We are going to call something a discrepancy if it is greater than $1 or 3% of the total invoice line. And we'll call it validated if it's either $0 or doesn't match the threshold for being considered a discrepancy. Finally, we want this to be nice and clean at the end, so we're going to reformat our data by only keeping a handful of columns plus the newly created discrepancy columns. And also, we're going to assign a final format to use for our currency values. Now we can see that Parabola added two new blocks of logic to our flow on the right-hand side. We have one dedicated step where we calculate our invoice discrepancy and status, and if I click into this step, we can see that the logic exactly matches our prompt, and we can see this new invoice discrepancy column where, for example, from earlier, we can see that big $10 discrepancy nice and highlighted in the dataset. We have another step here for finalizing our output, and in this step, we're only keeping those final columns that were requested and also doing our final formatting. So now we have 8 columns of data, really nice and easy to follow here in our final step. Now, in this example, Parabola used 2 steps to accomplish the job instead of the 1 step that we saw in previous transformations. My recommendation to you is to think of each of these steps as one section of logic in the SOP or process document you might create. By putting too much logic in one step, flows can become harder to follow and hand off to teammates, but by keeping everything nice and modular, it makes flows really easy to follow. If you do feel like one step is too confusing or there's too much logic, you can always go into a step and ask Parabola to either change the logic or even break it into separate steps so it's easier to follow. Now our data has been pulled, cleaned, combined, and transformed. So we're ready for the last piece of the flow framework. Before you jump to the next lesson on sending data, make sure to complete the building challenge at the bottom of this page where we'll actually transform our data.